when 44-year-old Marlene Voss walked into the Sundown Diner on the outskirts of a small high-desert town in New Mexico on a Tuesday morning in early March and sat in the same corner booth she had occupied every day for 11 days straight, ordering only black coffee and speaking to no one, wearing the same oversized flannel shirt and keeping her eyes on the door with the vigilance of someone expecting a specific kind of trouble. Most of the regulars had already decided she was not quite right. The waitresses had a rotation for who handled her table. The owner had twice considered asking her to leave and twice decided against it on account of the fact that she paid cash and caused no disturbance beyond the disturbance of her presence, which was the kind of disturbance that existed entirely in other people's discomfort rather than in anything she actually did. The truckers at the counter called her the ghost woman, not unkindly, but not kindly either, in the thoughtless way that people assign names to things they've decided not to understand. What nobody in that diner knew, because she had made absolutely certain that nobody would know, was that 32 miles away in a motel room with a broken heater and a door she'd reinforced with a chair wedged under the handle, a 6-year-old girl named Iris was watching cartoons on a tablet with the volume turned low and waiting for her mother to come back. And what none of them could have known, because it had not happened yet, was that on this particular Tuesday morning, the man Marlene Voss had been watching the door for it was going to walk through it, and that the only reason the next 4 minutes would not end in catastrophe was that a biker named Cal Dredge had chosen this particular diner for his breakfast stop and had spent enough years reading rooms to understand, in the first 30 seconds of walking through the door, that the woman in the corner booth was not crazy at all. She was cornered. And those were two entirely different things. The high desert in early March had a specific quality of light that Cal Dredge had always found honest. No softness to it, no flattery. It showed things as they were. He had been riding through it since leaving Albuquerque the previous afternoon, taking the long route east because he had the time, and because the long route through that particular landscape had a way of clarifying his thinking that nothing else quite replicated. He was 52 years old, a tall man with a rangy build that suggested he had been larger once and had burned the excess away through years of movement and not enough sitting still. His beard was the color of iron, and his eyes were the pale gray of the sky over the desert in winter, the kind of eyes that had been described as cold by people who didn't know him and as steady by people who did. He wore a black vest with the patches of the Mesa Dogs MC, a mid-sized club out of Albuquerque with a 16-year history of veteran outreach and a more recent but equally serious commitment to domestic violence shelter support, a cause that had come to the club through Cal's own initiative 6 years ago and had since become central to their community identity. He had been a paramedic for 19 years before a back injury took him off active duty, and before that, he had been in the Navy. And before that, he'd been a boy in a house where the door also needed something wedged under the handle on certain nights. He understood the architecture of fear. He had lived in it long enough to recognize its floor plan by feel, in the dark. He came into the Sundown Diner at 7:40 in the morning because his coffee had run out 2 hours earlier and his body had opinions about that. He held the door for an older man coming out, scanned the room in the automatic way he always scanned rooms, the paramedic habit that had outlasted the career, and in the first 30 seconds he had taken in the following: 6 people at the counter, 3 truckers, and a couple and a young man in work clothes, a waitress behind the pass-through, the owner visible through the kitchen window, and in the far corner booth, a woman. She was watching the door. Not the casual watching of someone waiting for a friend or monitoring the weather outside. She was watching it the way you watch something you were afraid of. Her coffee cup was in front of her, but her hands were around it rather than on the handle, a grip that was about something to hold rather than something to drink. Her position in the booth was specific: back to the wall, clear sight line to the entrance, no bag on the table, which meant either she had nothing with her or she had put it somewhere she could reach it fast. She was wearing a flannel shirt 2 sizes too large, which in March in the desert was not unusual, but the way she wore it suggested she was using it the way people use large clothing, as concealment, as a way of taking up less visible space. Cal did not stare. Staring was the wrong approach, and he knew it from both professional experience and personal history. He walked to the counter and ordered coffee and eggs and sat with his back to her, which put him between her and the door, which was also a choice. Though, if you had asked him in that moment, he might not have been able to articulate exactly why he made it. He had been there for 12 minutes when the door opened. The man who walked in was in his late 30s, a compact, well-maintained man in a canvas jacket and dark jeans, with the kind of deliberate pleasantness in his face that Cal had learned to read as performance rather than feeling. He was not visibly threatening. He did not raise his voice or move aggressively. He walked into the diner with the comfortable entitlement of someone who expected the space to accommodate him and looked around with an expression of mild, searching interest, like he was looking for someone he was pleased to have located. Cal did not turn around. He watched in the chrome surface of the napkin dispenser in front of him, and he saw, in that distorted silver reflection, the woman in the corner booth go absolutely rigid. Not the rigidity of surprise, the rigidity of confirmation, the specific stillness of someone whose worst expectation has just arrived. The man walked toward the corner booth. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this from today and what time it is where you are, because this story is going to remind you that the most dangerous situations are often the quietest ones, and that the people who seem strangest to us are sometimes the ones carrying the heaviest things. We put out a new story every single day on this channel, and we want to know where in the world our community is. Cal put down his coffee cup. He did not move quickly. Quick movements in situations like this one were the wrong instrument. He slid off his stool and walked toward the corner booth with the unhurried purpose of someone who had decided where he was going and felt no need to announce it. He got there at the same moment the man in the canvas jacket did, approaching from the opposite side, and he sat down across from the woman in the booth as though he had been expected, as though this was a meeting he was attending. And he looked at the man in the canvas jacket and said, in a voice that was entirely conversational and entirely unmovable, "She's with me." The man looked at Cal. He took in the vest and the patches and the size of the man wearing them and the specific quality of stillness in his pale gray eyes, and his expression went through several rapid calculations before settling on a version of itself that was still pleasant and now also careful. "I think there might be a misunderstanding," the man said. "This is my wife." Cal did not look at the woman. He kept his eyes on the man and said, still in the same conversational register, "Why don't you go ahead and sit down somewhere else and have some breakfast? I'll buy your coffee." The man's pleasantness developed an edge. "I don't think you understand the situation." Cal nodded once, slowly, as though considering this. "I understand it fine," he said. The man looked at the woman for the first time directly, and what passed between them in that look was not a communication between equals, and Cal felt it the way he had felt these things his entire life, in his chest, in the specific place where old knowledge lived. Then the man looked back at Cal and made the calculation that was available to him, which was that the biker in the booth was not going to move, and that creating a scene in a public diner with witnesses and a man who outweighed him by 40 pounds was not the optimal approach. He smiled, a careful and genuine smile, in a way that smiles could be genuine and also entirely cold. And he said, "We'll continue this conversation later," addressed to the woman and no one else. And he turned and walked back out the door. The diner went on around them. The truckers at the counter had not stopped talking. The waitress had not looked up from her order pad. The owner had not emerged from the kitchen. In the way of public spaces where no one wants to be involved, the room had collectively decided that nothing worth noticing had occurred. Cal looked at the woman across the booth for the first time directly. She was looking at the door. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, and they were doing several things at once, assessing him, processing what had just happened, deciding how much to trust and how quickly, running through the implications of the last 4 minutes with the rapid efficiency of someone who had been running implications for a long time. She said, "Why did you do that?" It was not a grateful question, it was a genuine one. She wanted to know his reasoning because his reasoning mattered to her assessment of him. Cal said, "Because you needed someone to sit down." She looked at him for another long moment. Her hands were still around the coffee cup. He noticed that they were not shaking, which told him something about the particular quality of what she had been carrying, that it had been carried long enough to stop producing tremors and had become instead a steady weight. "He's going to come back," she said. Cal nodded. "I know." "Then what?" he said. "That depends on some things." He paused. "Do you want to tell me what's happening, or do you want me to just sit here until you decide?" She looked at him. She looked at the door. She looked at her coffee. Then she said, "I have a daughter." And that was where the real story began. Her name was Marlene, and her daughter's name was Iris, and Iris was 6 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and a laugh that Marlene described in the particular way that parents describe the specific details of their children that they are most afraid of losing, carefully, with precision, as though the accuracy of the description was a form of safekeeping. Iris liked drawing horses, even though she had never been near one. She had a gap between her front teeth that the dentist said would close on its own. She called spaghetti by a word she had invented at age 3 that bore no resemblance to spaghetti and that Marlene had never corrected because she couldn't bring herself to. She was in a motel room 32 miles away right now watching cartoons on a tablet with the volume turned low because she had been taught, with the patient repetition of a child, learning something that should never be necessary to learn, that low volume was important when they were in new places. She knew not to open the door. She knew that if the tablet died, she should sit quietly and wait. She knew her mother was coming back. She had been taught to know this with a certainty that Marlene had worked very hard to make absolute, because the one thing she could not afford was for Iris to doubt it. Cal listened to all of this without interrupting. It was the skill he valued most in himself and had worked hardest to develop, the ability to receive what someone was telling him without redirecting it, without offering solutions before the problem had been fully described, without making the person feel that their story was taking too long. He had learned it first as a paramedic, where the information a patient volunteered in the first minutes could be the difference between the right intervention and the wrong one, and had deepened it in the 6 years of domestic violence shelter work, where he had sat across from enough people in enough corner booths, metaphorical and literal, to understand that what they needed before anything else was to be heard completely. The man's name was Dennis. She did not offer his last name, and Cal did not ask for it yet. Dennis had seemed, in the beginning, like the kind of man that people described with words like stable and reliable and level-headed, words that Marlene now understood were descriptions of control rather than character, that what had read as steadiness was actually the complete management of an environment and everyone in it. It had taken her 2 years to see it clearly, and another year to understand that seeing it clearly and being able to leave were not the same thing. The logistics of leaving were complicated in ways that people who had not done it rarely understood. Money that was technically shared but practically inaccessible. A phone that was technically hers but practically monitored. Family that was technically available but practically compromised by years of a narrative that Dennis had constructed with the patience and thoroughness of someone who understood that isolation was most effective when the isolated person believed it was their own choice. She had left 4 months ago with Iris and $412 in cash that she had accumulated over 8 months by skimming small amounts from grocery runs, $5 here, $8 there, the kind of invisible arithmetic that required the specific creativity of someone with no other options. She had been moving since then, not randomly. She had a direction, a sister in a city she was not going to name because naming it felt like a risk she wasn't ready to take. But the direction existed, and the plan existed, and it was a real plan built on real logistics, not on hope. The problem was that Dennis had resources she didn't, and had been looking since the day she left and had found her twice before. The first time she had seen him before he saw her, and they had moved. The second time had been closer, and they had moved faster. This time, she had spotted his car 2 days ago in the parking lot of a gas station in the next town, and she had not moved fast enough because Iris was sick with a low fever, and Marlene had made the calculation that moving a sick child through the cold in the middle of the night was its own kind of danger, and had decided to wait one more day, and had been watching the door of this diner every morning since, because she needed somewhere to be that was not the motel room, somewhere public with other people, because the particular arithmetic of her situation meant that public spaces were safer than private ones. Cal listened to all of this, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone formulating a response, but the quiet of someone making sure the person across from him understood that he had received everything they'd said. Then he said, "The motel you're in. Is it the Desert Rest off the county road?" She looked at him with a sharpening of attention. "How do you know that?" "Only motel within 20 miles that doesn't require a credit card," he said. "And you paid cash. It's where I'd be." She studied him. He let her study him. He understood that trust in her situation was not a feeling but a calculation, that she had to run the numbers on him the same way she ran them on everything, and that the calculation took as long as it took and could not be rushed without damaging the result. "You work with people like me," she said. It wasn't a question. She had read the patches on his vest and drawn a conclusion. "My club runs support operations for 3 shelters in New Mexico and 2 in Colorado," he said. "I've been doing this work for 6 years. Before that, I was a paramedic for 19 years. He paused. "And before any of that, I was a kid who knew what it sounded like when someone had a chair wedged under the door handle." Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, more like a particular kind of recognition, the look of someone who has been speaking a private language and has just heard it spoken back to them. "He's going to go to the motel," she said. "Now that he's seen me, he knows I'm close." Cal nodded. "How long before he figures out which one?" She thought about it with the practiced speed of someone who had been running these calculations for months. "He'll check the obvious ones first. There are 3 closer to town. Maybe an hour. Maybe less." "Then we have some things to do in the next hour," Cal said. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a woman named Rosa, who ran the intake coordination for a shelter network that the Mesa Dogs had worked with for 4 years. He told Rosa what he had in 3 sentences, the way you spoke to someone who understood the situation and did not need the emotional context filled in. Rosa said she had a safe house 40 miles north with a room available and a staff member who could meet them. She said she would call ahead. She said she would also make a call to a legal advocate she knew who specialized in emergency protective orders and who had, on more than one occasion, moved faster than the official timeline when the circumstances required it. Cal said thank you and ended the call. The second call was to a man named Boone, the Mesa Dogs chapter vice president, who was currently 2 hours west of their location on a ride that had no fixed destination. Cal told him the situation in 4 sentences. Boone said he would call Shepard and Trace and that the 3 of them would be at the Sundown Diner in 90 minutes. "Not here," Cal said. "The motel. We need to move the woman and her daughter before he gets there. Meet me at Desert Rest off County Road 7, Boone said. "We'll be there in 80. Cal put his phone away and looked at Marlene, who had been listening to both calls with the focused attention of someone assessing whether the net that was being described was actually there or whether it was being described to make her stay still. "You're not going to ask me if I want this," she said. "I'm going to ask you right now," he said. "Do you want this? Because nothing that just happened means anything unless you do. You're the one making the decisions here. I'm just offering options." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the diner windows, the high desert light was doing its honest work on the landscape, showing everything as it was. "He has a lawyer," she said. "A good one. Every time I've tried to get legal help, he's been ahead of me. He knows people. He's very good at seeming reasonable." "Rosa's contact has handled cases like that before," Cal said. "That's specifically what she does." Marlene looked at the door. Then she looked back at Cal. She said, "Iris is scared of loud motorcycles." Cal almost smiled. "We'll keep the engines quiet when we get to the motel. Give her some time to get used to them before we move." "She doesn't like strangers. None of us are at our best with strangers," Cal said. "She'll decide for herself when she's ready." Marlene was quiet for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and drank from it for the first time since Cal had sat down, a real drink, not the holding she'd been doing before. She set the cup down and looked at him with the expression of someone who has run the numbers and arrived at a conclusion they are prepared to act on. "He takes Iris to his mother's house when he has her for visitation," she said. "His mother doesn't like me. She's told him things I said that I never said. She's part of how the narrative works." She paused. "I need you to understand that this is not a simple situation. I know how it looks from the outside. I know that people see a woman moving around with a child and they think certain things." Cal said, I see a woman who has been doing an extraordinarily difficult thing for 4 months with no resources and no support, and who has kept her daughter safe the entire time. That's what I see." Marlene looked at him with an expression that was complicated in ways that had to do with how long it had been since someone had said something to her that was simply true, without agenda, without the particular kind of kindness that asks for something back. If this story is showing you something true about the people who get called crazy for reasons that have nothing to do with their sanity and everything to do with what they're surviving, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and share this video. We upload a new story every single day because we believe these stories matter. Because every person who watches until the end is someone who is willing to see clearly, and the world needs more of that. They left the diner 7 minutes later. Cal left cash on the table that covered both their coffees and a tip that was larger than necessary because the waitress had refilled Marlene's cup twice without being asked and had asked no questions, and that was its own kind of kindness that deserved acknowledgement. Marlene walked to his bike with the careful posture of someone moving through a space they are assessing for danger at every step, and he matched her pace without comment, putting himself between her and the road in the automatic way. And when they reached the Road King, she looked at it with the expression of someone recalibrating an expectation. "I've never been on one," she said. He handed her his spare helmet. 32 miles, he said. 25 minutes. Then we get Iris and we go somewhere he can't follow." She took the helmet. She looked at it for a moment, and then she put it on with the decisive movement of someone who is committed to a direction. Cal swung onto the bike and she got on behind him, and he felt her hands find a grip on the sides of his vest rather than around his waist. The grip of someone maintaining as much independence of contact as the situation allowed, and he understood that too, and said nothing about it, and started the engine. They rode out of the sundown diner parking lot into the high desert morning, and the light was exactly what it always was out there, honest and clear and entirely without mercy, showing the road ahead exactly as it was, no more and no less, which was all anyone in that situation could reasonably ask for. 23 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of the Desert Rest Motel, and Marlene was off the bike before Cal had the kickstand down, moving toward room 7 with her key already in her hand, and Cal stayed by the bike and watched her go and gave her the space to be the first thing her daughter saw when that door opened, because that was the right order for things, and he knew it without having to think about it. He heard the door open. He heard a child's voice say, "Mama," with the specific intonation that the word carries when it has been waiting to be said for hours and is finally allowed out. And then he heard Marlene's voice, lower, saying, I'm here, I'm right here." And the door stayed open and the high desert light came in off the parking lot, and somewhere in that room, a 6-year-old girl with dark eyes and a gap in her front teeth and a word for spaghetti that wasn't spaghetti was being held by her mother, and Cal leaned against his Road King and looked at the mountains to the north and gave them whatever time they needed. Boone and Shepard and Trace arrived 11 minutes later, 3 bikes pulling into the lot with their engines at the respectful low rumble of men who had been told there was a child who needed time to adjust to them. They parked and killed the engines, and Boone walked over to Cal and stood beside him and said quietly, "What are we dealing with?" Cal told him in the compressed language of men who had worked together long enough to communicate efficiently. Boone listened and nodded and looked at the open door of room 7 and then back at Cal. "She trust you?" he asked. "She's running the numbers," Cal said. "She's smart. She'll get there." Boone nodded. "Rose's contact called me on the way. Legal advocate is filing for an emergency protective order this afternoon. She needs Marlene on a call at 2 o'clock. Cal checked his watch. "We can do that from the safe house. We'll be there by noon." "And the husband?" Cal looked at the motel entrance. "He'll come here. When he does, he'll find an empty room and no forwarding information." He looked at Boone. "Make sure there's no forwarding information," Boone said. "Understood," and went to have a quiet word with the motel manager, which Cal knew would involve a combination of explanation and the particular persuasive authority of a large man in a leather vest who was clearly on the right side of a situation and needed cooperation to stay there. Inside room 7, Iris Voss was meeting a biker for the first time. She stood behind her mother's legs and looked at Cal Dredge with the frank, unfiltered assessment that 6-year-olds applied to strangers, no politeness obscuring the evaluation, no social performance softening the scrutiny. She was small for 6, with her mother's dark eyes and the gap-toothed mouth Marlene had described, and hair that had been put into 2 uneven braids that suggested Marlene had done them herself in a motel bathroom mirror with no help and limited supplies. She was wearing a purple sweatshirt with a cartoon cloud on it and leggings with small stars and socks that didn't match, one yellow and one white, and she was holding a stuffed horse, not a rabbit, a horse, brown and worn at the ears from handling, that she pressed against her collarbone with both arms while she looked at Cal. Cal crouched down to her level the way he had crouched down to the level of children his entire adult life, not as a technique, but as a basic courtesy, because conversations conducted with a significant height differential were always negotiations of power, and he had no interest in that particular negotiation with a 6-year-old. "That's a good horse," he said. She looked at the horse, then back at him. "His name is Canyon," she said. Cal nodded seriously. "That's a good name for a horse." She considered him for another moment. She looked at his vest, at the patches, with the same focused attention her mother had given them, and he understood that she was doing a version of what Marlene did, reading the available information and drawing conclusions. She pointed at the largest patch, the Mesa Dog's emblem, and said, "Is that your dog?" "That's my club's dog," he said. "My club is called the Mesa Dogs. Do you have a real dog?" "I have a dog named Fletcher. He's old and he sleeps most of the time." Something shifted in Iris's expression, a slight softening around the eyes that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I like dogs," she said. "Fletcher would like you," Cal said. "He likes people who are direct." Iris looked at her mother. "Mama, he has a dog named Fletcher." Marlene's hand was on her daughter's shoulder, and her face was doing the complicated work of a person holding themselves together in front of their child, the particular composure that parents maintained in front of small children, not to deceive them, but to give them a stable surface to stand on while the adult processed the larger terrain. "I heard," she said. "That's nice." Iris looked back at Cal. She took one step out from behind Marlene's legs, not a full commitment, just a reconnaissance. "Are those men outside your friends?" she asked. "They are," Cal said. "Their names are Boone and Shepard and Trace. They rode their motorcycles here to help your mom." Iris absorbed this. She looked at the open doorway where the morning light came in off the parking lot, and the distant shapes of the 3 men were visible near the bikes, all of them carefully not looking at the door, giving the room its privacy. "Why do they have motorcycles?" she said. "Because they like to ride," Cal said, "and because motorcycles can go places fast when someone needs help." She thought about this with the visible working concentration that young children brought to new information. Then she said, "We needed help." "You did," Cal said, "and your mom did a very good job getting it." Iris looked up at Marlene with an expression that contained several things, relief and pride, and the residue of 2 days of low fever and muted cartoons in waiting. And Marlene looked back at her daughter, and whatever composure she had been maintaining developed a visible crack that she repaired quickly and thoroughly in the way she had clearly been repairing cracks for a long time. "Can I see the motorcycles?" Iris asked. Cal looked at Marlene. Marlene nodded once. Cal stood and held out his hand, and Iris looked at it for a moment, and then took it with the decisive grip of a child who had made a choice and was committing to it, and they walked out into the high desert morning together, the large man in the iron-colored beard and the small girl with the mismatched socks, and the worn horse pressed against her collarbone. Boone saw them coming and turned fully away from his bike to face them, which was the right instinct, making himself visible and readable rather than letting himself be approached from an angle. Shepard and Trace did the same, 3 large men in leather arranging themselves with the careful deliberateness of people who understood that their size was information a child was processing and that the processing deserved support. Iris stopped a few feet away and looked at the 3 bikes. She looked at the men. She looked at Boone specifically, who was the largest of them, 6'3" and broad, with a red beard and a pattern of freckles across his nose that Iris apparently found interesting, because she stared at them with open curiosity. "You have dots on your face," she said. Boone said, "I do. I've had them my whole life." "I have one," Iris said. She pointed to a spot on her left cheek. "Just one, though." Boone leaned down slightly to look at the indicated spot with appropriate seriousness. "That's a good one," he said, "quality over quantity." Iris considered this and appeared to find it satisfactory. She looked at his bike. "Is that yours?" "That's mine. Her name is Rosalind." Iris looked at the motorcycle and then back at Boone. "Why is it a her?" Boone thought about it. "Because she's carried me through everything and never let me down," he said. "That seemed like a her to me." Iris nodded slowly in the way she had of processing information that was new but made sense. She looked at Cal. "What's your motorcycle's name?" Cal said. "I call her the Road King because that's what she is." Iris's gap-toothed mouth curved. "That's not a real name," she said. "That's just what kind she is." Cal said, "You're right. I'll work on that." The child almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh, but it was the architecture of one, the shape that a laugh makes in a face before it fully arrives, and Marlene, standing in the motel doorway watching, made a sound that was very quiet, and that she covered immediately, but that Cal heard because he was always listening for the sounds that people tried not to make. They loaded what there was to load, which was not much, a duffel bag and a backpack and the tablet, and a plastic bag with some food items, the spare and portable inventory of people who had learned to keep their possessions at a weight that allowed for rapid movement. Marlene moved through the motel room with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had packed under pressure before, checking under the bed and in the bathroom and behind the door with automatic precision. She left nothing. Cal noticed this and said nothing about it because there was nothing to say. It was competence. It deserved acknowledgement through respect, not commentary. Boone had arranged with the motel manager, a tired man named Gerald who had seen things in his years of running a cash-only establishment that had given him a reliable instinct for which situations required his cooperation and which required his ignorance, that no information about the room's recent occupant would be available to anyone who came asking. Gerald had nodded with the expression of a man who understood the situation entirely and wanted no further details. Boone had thanked him and left an amount of cash on the counter that covered the room for 2 additional nights, a deliberate misdirection in the records that would cost Dennis time he didn't have. They left the Desert Rest at 9:47 in the morning. Marlene rode with Cal because Iris had made her preference known with the directness that had characterized all of her communications. She wanted to ride with the man with the dog named Fletcher, which was Cal, and Marlene had looked at her daughter and then at Cal with the expression of a parent making a rapid assessment of the relative safety of a situation and had said, "Stay in the middle of the group." Cal had said, "The whole time." Iris rode in front of Cal with his arms on either side of her reaching the handlebars, hemmed in and secure, her worn horse tucked inside his jacket at her insistence so that Canyon wouldn't get cold, which Cal had agreed to with complete seriousness because the horse's thermal comfort was clearly not a matter open to negotiation. She wore a helmet that Trace had produced from his saddlebag, a spare that was too large but that he'd padded with a folded bandana until it sat adequately, and she looked out at the high desert road ahead with the expression of someone encountering a new thing and finding that it was better than expected. They rode north in formation, 4 bikes, Cal and Iris at the center, Boone and Shepard flanking, Trace behind, moving through the landscape at a speed that was careful and deliberate, the kind of riding that was about arrival rather than the road itself. The desert opened around them in every direction, red rock and sparse scrub, and the particular vast silence of the high plateau that the engine noise moved through without filling. After about 10 minutes, Iris turned her head slightly toward Cal and said something that was lost in the wind and engine sound, and he leaned his head down, and she said it again, louder. "It's very big," she said. Cal said, "It is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I like it." The safe house was a single-story adobe on a property outside a small town that had been used by Rose's network for 3 years, maintained by a rotating group of volunteers, and funded through a combination of private donors and a grants program that one of the network's board members had spent 18 months assembling. It looked, from the road, like any other property in that part of the state, undistinguished and quiet. That was by design. Inside, it was clean and warm and had a room with 2 beds and a window that looked out at a courtyard with a cottonwood tree that was just beginning to show its early spring leaves. Rosa herself was waiting on the front step when they pulled in. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the specific kind of calm that came from years of working in situations where panic was a luxury no one could afford. She had done intake for more than 300 people over 8 years of this work, and she had learned to read the condition of someone arriving the way a doctor read a patient, quickly and without making the reading visible. She looked at Marlene getting off the bike, and she looked at Iris being handed down from in front of Cal, still holding Canyon, the helmet at a slight angle from the bandana padding, and she came down the step and crouched in front of Iris first, before she said anything to Marlene, which was the right choice, and Cal recognized it as such. "I'm Rosa," she said. "I made breakfast. Do you like eggs?" Iris looked at her. "I like eggs if they're not runny," she said. Rosa said, "I feel exactly the same way. Come in and tell me if I got it right." And Iris went with her, still carrying Canyon, into the house, and Marlene stood in the courtyard and watched her daughter walk through the door, and something in her posture changed. Not collapsed, not released, but shifted, the way a structure shifts when the load it has been bearing is redistributed, and the weight is finally shared among more points than one. She stood straighter, which looked paradoxically like she was also less rigid, and she put one hand over her mouth for a moment and looked at the cottonwood tree with its new leaves and breathed. Cal stood nearby and did not speak. Boone and Shepard and Trace stayed by the bikes and talked quietly among themselves, about nothing in particular, giving the moment its necessary space. After a while, Marlene lowered her hand and looked at Cal. She said, "People thought I was unstable when I first left. My mother-in-law told my sister that I'd had a breakdown. Dennis told people at his office that he was worried about my mental state." She paused. There were 2 people at the command post where they set up the search for Lily. She stopped. She'd used the wrong name, the name from the wrong story, the name of someone else's child from something she'd heard or read, and she corrected herself without explanation. 2 people at a community support meeting I went to before we left. They told me to consider that maybe I was misremembering things, that the stress was distorting my perception. She looked at Cal steadily. "He does that very well. Makes the people around you start to wonder if you are the problem." Cal said, "You are not the problem." She said, "I know that now." She paused. "I knew it then too, but knowing it, and being able to hold onto it in the face of everyone around you reflecting the other version back at you are different skills. I had to work very hard to keep knowing it." "That's not instability," Cal said. "That's endurance. Those are opposite things." Marlene looked at him, and in her expression was the particular quality of someone receiving a truth they have believed privately for a long time and are now hearing confirmed from outside themselves for the first time, the specific relief of external verification. The 2 o'clock call with the legal advocate went for an hour and 20 minutes. Her name was Dara, and she had a precise, rapid manner of speaking that communicated both competence and momentum, the voice of someone who moved through bureaucratic systems fast enough that the systems didn't have time to solidify around her. She told Marlene what she needed, which was documentation, which Marlene had, because Marlene had spent 8 months before leaving making copies of things and storing them in an email account that existed on no device Dennis had ever touched. Medical records, financial records, photographs. A log she had kept for 14 months in a document she titled Grocery Lists, so that if it was ever found, it would look like what it didn't look like. Dara said the log alone was more thorough than anything she'd seen from a non-legally trained person, and that it would matter significantly. She said she would have paperwork filed by end of business, and that Marlene should expect a hearing within 72 hours. Cal sat in the courtyard during the call and drank coffee that Rosa had brought him and watched the cottonwood tree and thought about the morning. About the woman in the corner booth and the 40-odd minutes that had preceded him walking through the door of the sundown diner, all the mornings she had sat at that table watching the door, and all the people who had decided she was not quite right and looked away. He thought about what it cost a person to be accurately perceiving danger in an environment that was collectively telling them that their perception was the problem. He thought about the specific kind of strength required to maintain clarity under that pressure. For the sustained period she had maintained it, moving through motels and diners and cold nights with a sick child and a chair against the door handle, keeping Iris fed and warm and as close to okay as the situation allowed, making and executing a plan that had no margin and no safety net for 4 months alone. Because that was the truth of it, wasn't it? That the woman everyone in the sundown diner had decided was not quite right had been in fact more precisely right about her situation than anyone around her. That what read as instability was actually a hyper-accurate threat assessment operating in an environment specifically designed to make her doubt it. That the people who called her crazy were either deceived or doing the deceiving. And that the difference between being crazy and being in danger while everyone told you that you weren't was something that required a specific kind of seeing to distinguish, the kind that came from experience, from history, from knowing what the architecture of fear felt like from the inside. That one person willing to sit down in a booth and say she's with me could change the entire geometry of a morning. And that 4 bikers riding north through the high desert with a child who had named her Stuffed Horse Canyon and wanted to know if Fletcher would like her could be the difference between a woman's plan reaching its destination and being pulled back before it got there. The protective order was granted in 61 hours. Dara called Marlene with the news, and Marlene sat in the kitchen of the safe house with Iris drawing horses at the table beside her, and said thank you in the voice of someone for whom those 2 words were carrying more than 2 words could reasonably hold. Dennis came to the safe house. That was not something anyone had expected with confidence, but it was something Cal had considered possible and had discussed with Rosa and with Boone in the first hours after their arrival. He came on the second day, which meant he had been working his resources hard and fast and had found more than they'd hoped he would find. He came in the early afternoon, and he came alone, and he knocked on the door with the pleasant, reasonable face fully deployed. And Rosa answered it, and he explained that he was looking for his wife and daughter, and that he was very concerned, and that he had reason to believe they were here. Rosa said, "I don't have any information that would help you." He said he had a right to see his daughter. Rosa said he should speak to his attorney, and she closed the door. He stood outside for 6 minutes. Cal watched him from the window, the way he stood in the courtyard with his pleasant face doing its calculations, looking at the property with the assessing gaze of someone determining options. Then he took out his phone and made a call and walked back to his car and drove away. 2 hours later, Dara called. He'd had his lawyer contact hers. The protective order was holding. He had been advised to have no further contact with Marlene or Iris pending the hearing. He had, Dara said, the tone of a woman reporting a fact she found professionally satisfying, considerably fewer options than he was accustomed to having. On the 4th day, Marlene's sister arrived. Her name was Paula, and she drove a green sedan, and she came through the door of the safe house and grabbed her sister in the doorway. And they held each other for a long time without speaking, and Iris watched from the hallway, and then walked over and inserted herself into the middle of the embrace with the practical confidence of a child who had decided the hug was large enough to accommodate her and had been correct. Cal was in the courtyard when this happened. He heard it through the open window, and he did not go inside. This was Paula's moment, and Marlene's moment, and Iris's moment, and his role in it was to have made it possible, and then to step back and let it be what it was. He was getting ready to go, saddlebag repacked, helmet on the seat when Marlene came out. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she held one out to him, and he took it. They stood in the courtyard for a moment in the same companionable quiet that had characterized the useful parts of their acquaintance. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about endurance and instability being opposite things," Cal said. "It's true." "I know," she said. "I'm going to need to hear it a few more times before it lives somewhere permanent." She looked at him. "But I'm going to get there." Cal nodded. He looked at the cottonwood tree. Its leaves were a little further along than they had been 4 days ago, the green deeper and more committed. From inside the house they could hear Iris explaining to Paula that Cal had a dog named Fletcher who was old and slept a lot, and that Boone had freckles, and the Canyon had ridden inside a biker's jacket all the way from the motel and had not been cold at all. Cal drank his coffee. He thought about the sundown diner and the woman in the corner booth who everyone had decided was not quite right. and about what it had cost her to sit there every morning watching the door, and about the specific quality of steadiness it required to maintain a true perception of reality when reality was being actively contested by people with more resources and more support than you had. He thought about Iris in her mismatched socks, looking at the high desert from the front of a motorcycle and saying it's very big, and then, after a moment, I like it. He thought about all the women sitting in all the corner booths of all the diners in all the small towns he had ridden through, watching the doors, being assigned names by people who found it easier to label than to understand. He thought about the ones he had not seen, the ones where no one sat down. The Mesa Dogs expanded their safe house network in the 18 months following that morning. They added 2 properties in partnership with Rosa's organization and established a coordination protocol with 3 other MC chapters in the region to extend coverage across a wider geography. They trained 12 club members in trauma-informed communication practices and created a rapid response system that could be activated by a single call. They called it the Sit-Down Initiative, which was not a formal name exactly, more a description, because the thing that started it was simply that. Someone who needed help. Someone who sat down. Marlene sent Cal a photograph 6 months later. It was taken in Paula's backyard in the city she had not named, showing Iris on a sunny afternoon standing next to a large, elderly golden retriever who was being very patient about having his ears examined. The dog's name was Fletcher. Cal had driven 300 miles with him in the truck to introduce him to a 6-year-old he'd been told would appreciate meeting him. Fletcher had been patient about the drive and then about the ears, and Iris had declared him the best dog she had ever met, which Cal had relayed to Fletcher, who had received the compliment with characteristic dignity, and then gone to sleep in the sun. On the back of the photograph, Marlene had written 2 sentences in her careful, precise handwriting. She is doing well. So am I. Cal kept the photograph in the inside pocket of his vest. Not framed, not displayed, just there, close, a piece of evidence he carried against the days when the work was hard and the outcomes were unclear, and he needed a reminder that the right thing at the right moment, even a small thing, a cup of coffee and a decision to sit down, could change the entire direction of a life. He thought sometimes about Gerald the motel manager and his reliable instinct for cooperation. He thought about Rosa crouching in front of Iris and asking about eggs. He thought about Boone and his freckles and his bike named Rosalind, and the way Iris had told him that quality was better than quantity, with the authority of someone who had given the matter serious consideration. He thought about Marlene in the corner booth with her hands around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking, watching the door for 11 days, keeping her daughter safe and her plan intact and her perception of reality clear in the face of sustained pressure designed to obscure it, doing all of this quietly and continuously without anyone in that diner understanding what they were actually looking at. He thought about what it meant to be seen. Not rescued, not fixed, not explained to. Just seen. Accurately. By someone who understood the difference between crazy and cornered and chose to sit down. Thank you for watching this story. If it reminded you that the people who seem strangest to us are often the ones carrying things we can't see, that what looks like instability from the outside is sometimes precision surviving under pressure, and that the smallest acts of witness, a seat in a booth, a hand held out, a decision not to look away, can be the thing that changes everything, please share this video. Subscribe to this channel because we put out a new story every single day. Stories about the people who sit down, who show up, who choose to see clearly when it would be easier not to. Tell us in the comments where you watch this from and what time it is there. Our community is everywhere, and every one of you who stayed until the end already knows what it means to pay attention. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything.